2020 may go down in the history books as the most boring, least eventful year on record. For me at least. I hear other people had problems with some sort of virus that's been going around, and on the other side of the planet some other doddering old man got voted out and yet another doddering old man got voted in, while in the UK still more doddering old men have been trying to figure out how to get the whole place out of Europe. Which I imagine is going to be tough. The British Isles may be relatively small, but you'll still need one hell of a tugboat to drag them further out to sea. And it seems like they're going to have to chop off Ireland as well, which is going to require quite a lot of digging. For me though, it's been a pretty boring year. Social distancing might have been a challenge for others, but for me it's a lifestyle I've been thriving in for decades. Well, thriving may not be the right word. Surviving at least. I have played some video games this year though, so that was nice. Many of them I've already given their own individual videos, but there were a bunch of other games that I either couldn't be bothered making a video on, or that I didn't really play comprehensively enough to make a video about, or that I didn't think would be a good subject for a video. That said, there are a couple of games here that I fully intend to dedicate a video to at some point, but if I never get around to it, which is likely, I want to at least talk about them a little. Oh, and just to clarify, these are games I've been playing this year, not necessarily ones that came out this year. I've put them in alphabetical order. I couldn't really come up with any other order that made sense. So that means the first game I'll be covering is Bloons Tower Defense 6. Now great, well there's my credibility as a serious gamer gone out the window, if I ever had any. And not that I really care what makes someone a serious gamer, it seems like a pretty meaningless distinction to me. But yes, the first game on the list is a super casual game, a tower defense with a cartoony style. For some reason I love tower defense games. They're simple, they mostly don't take too much brain power, and yet they provide all the ingredients my gaming brain requires. There's a sense of progress as your towers get stronger, there's the thrill of seeing countless thousands of your enemies mowed down before the might of your stalwart defences, there's the satisfaction of devising cunning strategies, and you can do all that while only paying attention with 20% of your brain while you watch Netflix on another screen or something. Stuff like this is the gaming equivalent of junk food, and just like actual junk food, I find it very tough to resist. And this particular tower defense game is, well, I can't exactly say it's good. I don't particularly like the cartoony art style. The main antagonists are balloons, which rank pretty damn low on the list of most compelling video game villains. It's extremely simple even by tower defense standards. And yet, thanks to that very simplicity, it's so easy to just load up and get into that it's become my go-to when I need something to occupy my ADD-addled brain when I should be concentrating on something else. Okay, next game is Borderlands 3. I was a huge fan of the first two Borderlands games, especially the second, which I sunk several hundred hours into, exploring different character builds, accumulating all the best loot, and relishing shooting Handsome Jack right in his handsome face at every opportunity. But I came into Borderlands 3 with rather muted expectations. Everyone seemed to agree that while the gameplay was still fundamentally solid, the story was irritating at best and dreadful at worst. And given that the story of Borderlands 2 was unexpectedly really rather good, I was kind of disappointed to hear that. However, I was pleasantly surprised. I'm not going to say the story reaches the heights of the previous Borderlands games, and the Calypso twins weren't quite on par with Handsome Jack when it came to villains, but hell, I enjoyed it well enough. And while the gameplay didn't do much that was new, it was as solid as ever, and refined just enough to make the whole experience fun and easy to enjoy all over again. A little too easy perhaps. The balance in Borderlands games has always been a little broken, but in this game it seemed I couldn't turn a corner without finding some new legendary weapon that would allow me to absolutely melt even the toughest bosses. And that's me saying that, the doddering old man with mush for brains and arthritic twigs for fingers, so you know the weapons have to be overpowered. But hey, I'm not complaining. Games like this are at their best when they're a power fantasy, in my opinion, and it takes me a long time to tire of headshotting enemies with an assault rifle that then makes them explode in a storm of acid, fire, and electricity. Next game is another FPS, but one I enjoy for completely different reasons. Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War. Yes, I enjoy Call of Duty games. Well, the ones I've played anyway. I don't buy every one of them that comes on the market, there's just so damn many of them these days. But every 2 or 3 years I'll pick one up, and yes, I'll enjoy it. I know this doesn't sit too well with the doddering old man persona I've crafted for myself, at least not on the surface, COD is supposedly the territory of beer-chugging frat boys and 13-year-olds up past their bedtime and being edgy by yelling racist slurs over voice chat. And I am neither of those things. But goddammit if I don't just find the multiplayer incredibly fun. I am aware that Call of Duty games have campaigns. Well, mostly at least. I tend to ignore them. When I've tried playing them, I found them so aggressively boring that my brain has switched itself off and refused to reactivate until I play at some stimulating classical music. Prokofiev usually does the trick. The multiplayer though, the fast-paced, high-octane, explosive warfare, I find that highly addictive. Naturally, I am terrible at it. But in my video on League of Legends, I talked about the importance of finding a reason to play competitive online games other than actually being good at them. And COD games tend to be extremely good at providing that reason, in the form of its progression system. Every gun in the game has challenges associated with it, mostly simple stuff like racking up a certain number of kills or headshots or long-range kills or whatever. These challenges unlock camos, basically different paint jobs for the gun. Complete every challenge for a certain gun, you unlock a gold camo for it. Get the gold camo for every gun in a certain class, such as assault rifles or submachine guns, and you get diamond camos for all those guns. Get the gold camo for every gun in the game, and you unlock the elusive dark matter camo. I've only ever achieved this in one COD game, Black Ops 3, over half a decade ago. It took me over 500 hours of playtime. Most of the challenges are easy even for people like me, just play long enough and you'll kill enough enemies to complete most of them. But you also need to get a certain number of 5-kill streaks, and for me, that took a while, especially on the guns I was particularly bad at. But I enjoyed every step of the way, and it was a hugely satisfying achievement when I finally did it. I'm sure anyone who's actually good at the game finds this laughable. They're probably more interested in maintaining a high kill-death ratio, or racking up the 30-kill streaks. And there are people who will just never ever care about Call of Duty at all. That's fine, I totally understand that. Up until I found myself hugely addicted to Black Ops 3, I was the same. But ultimately, it's just a fun, compelling, low-stress game, as long as you don't mind losing. And this new one, Cold War, well, it seems pretty good to me. It plays well, the weapons are fun to use, the maps are decent enough. Apparently it also includes Ronald Reagan, which is a definite downside, but fortunately he seems to stick solely to the campaign, where he can't bother me. Okay, next game. It's another first-person shooter of sorts, but you can't ignore the campaign in this one. Cyberpunk 2077. Oh boy, now here's a sore point in the gaming world, at the moment at least. Let me say at the outset that I personally have encountered very few technical issues on the PC version, certainly no more than your average open world game, and none of them have significantly impacted my experience. I know it's a rather heated topic at the moment, and that's understandable, but for now I'm just going to be looking at the game for what it is, and not all the stuff surrounding it. I should point out though that I'm still making my way through it, and I haven't finished it yet, so none of my opinions should be taken as fully formed. This is really more just my first impressions. But as it stands now, I'd say it's a decent game with some major flaws, quite apart from the technical ones. My main problems with it stem from the fact it just seems to be, I don't know, trying a bit too hard. They really try to hit both the cyber and the punk elements really hard. Every character, every line of dialogue is edgy as hell, and every design choice seems intended to remind you that this is the future, where technology rules. The result is a world that just doesn't feel in any way natural or organic. And I know organic might seem like an odd word to use about a game where the setting is a techno-metropolis, but what I mean is there's no sense that this place was an evolution or extrapolation of the world we live in. It was just created from whole cloth as a playground for the protagonist. But what a playground it is. Night City and its surrounds are just gorgeous, and on the surface level at least, it may just be the best recreation of a city in a game ever. Dig below the surface and it falls a little short, but I don't think it's worse in this respect than most open world games. And apart from the overbearing grimness of the characters and the dialogue, the main story and other narrative elements are solid enough. Ultimately, provided your experience is not ruined by technical issues, it's a solid game. Does it live up to the incredible hype? Not really, but I'm not sure anything could.
Tell me what's going on.
Well, next up is another rather grim game, but one that uses its bleakness to far better effect. Disco Elysium. I'd say that of all the games I've played in my entire life, Planescape Torment had the best writing. I don't necessarily mean that it had the best overall story, although it may actually have had that as well. I mean it had the best writing on a sentence-by-sentence, word-by-word level. And that's good, because it was one hell of a wordy game, and if the writing had been rough, it would have been difficult to get through. My first thought about Disco Elysium was that I didn't know if I could ever play a game with that title. I don't mind disco, but I couldn't really imagine playing a game based around it, unless it was some sort of rhythm game. My second thought about Disco Elysium was that so many people were comparing the quality of the writing to Planescape Torment that I had no choice but to check it out. And I'm so glad I did. It's another game I haven't actually finished yet, but I've sunk quite a few hours into it, and I can confirm that it's definitely up there with Planescape Torment. It's very, very different to that game, but yes, the writing is just phenomenal. I knew I was going to love it when I managed to die of a heart attack while fiddling around with a light fixture within the first 3 minutes of playing. And the surprises keep coming. I think one of the best things about the game is that it almost completely avoids cliches, while still constructing a world that is utterly believable and interesting and unique without being distractingly outlandish. That's a tough balance to strike when it comes to world building. It is a bleak world, almost depressingly so at times, but again it balances this bleakness with moments of true believable emotion. It really is an amazing game, and I'd like to do a video on it sometime, but there's no way I'm smart or dedicated enough to do it justice. Go and watch Noah Caldwell-Gervais's video on it. I haven't actually seen it yet because I want to finish the game first, but that guy has never made a video that was less than fascinating. Okay, next game, which is something quite a bit more simple. DJ Max Respect V, or maybe it's Respect 5, I honestly don't know. You might know from some of my other videos that I absolutely love rhythm games. DJ Max is a rhythm game in its purest form. You press buttons in time to the music. That's pretty much all there is to it. There's no story, there's no fancy gimmick, you just pick a song you like, choose a difficulty you can handle, and then you press buttons. It's fun, it's insanely challenging at harder difficulty settings, and that's really all there is to say about it. No, the music selection is fine, I guess. There's some stuff I really like, and a lot I can take or leave. It probably helps if you're a K-pop fan. By the way, in the footage you're seeing now, there should be like background animations and so forth, but for some reason they've stopped working on my copy of the game for no reason I can figure out. And apart from that, there's really not much else to talk about with this, so it's on to the next game. Doom Eternal. Oh man, Doom Eternal. As I mentioned a while back, I had every intention of doing a video on this game, and I may well still do one at some point. The thing is, when I was writing about it, I just couldn't stop finding little things to nitpick, and I realised I was treating the game rather unfairly. But now, in this video, maybe this brief write-up is a better opportunity to air some of my grievances. First though, let me say it's an incredible game. Everything it sets out to do, it does brilliantly well. The gameplay is fast and finely tuned, the level design is a real step up from Doom 2016, well, for most of the levels anyway. It sounds great and it looks amazing. Honestly, the technology behind Doom Eternal is fantastic. I don't think I've ever seen a game look so good while running so smoothly. Even on my old computer I was able to set it to 4K with automatic resolution scaling, and although it very rarely actually hit 4K, it handled the scaling so well, I really felt I was getting the optimal experience. But there is one main thing that prevented me from fully enjoying Doom Eternal and calling it my favourite Doom-related thing, and that's the way glory kills work. You really need to use glory kills in order to both conserve ammo and regenerate health, and if you're as bad as me, you will always need to regenerate health. The thing is, to execute a glory kill, you need to not kill enemies, you need to get them to low health. And for me, that is absolutely antithetical to the Doom experience. You need to hold back, you need to be careful not to unload too much fiery death into the faces of your demonic foes. That may seem like a small thing, but it had a big impact on my enjoyment of the game. Also, the whole thing just seems a little too complicated with all its upgrades and skill points and weapon mods. I know I'm pretty much alone in this. Everyone else seems to love the game unreservedly, and that's fine, it really is a great game. I just can't quite get over the fact that it's not old school Doom. And yes, I know I'm not exactly being fair here, but I never claimed to be objective. Right, so on to another game that I perhaps should have loved more than I did. Kingdom Hearts Melody of Memory. I've already mentioned that I love rhythm games, and if you've watched some of my other videos, you might know I love Kingdom Hearts. So combining the two should be a winning formula for me, right? Well, not quite. For one thing, while I absolutely love Kingdom Hearts, I don't think its music is its strongest element. At least, certainly not in the same way that Final Fantasy's music is. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of it I love. In fact, there are a couple of tracks that rank amongst my all-time favourites. But in my opinion, most of the music in Kingdom Hearts ranges from basically okay to quite good. The combat themes tend to be a little samey and unremarkable, and the world themes are, well, much the same, although some of them incorporate catchy and memorable Disney tunes. so I find the soundtrack of this game mostly underwhelming, with a few absolute masterpieces thrown in. That wouldn't be too much of an issue if the gameplay was super compelling, but it's not. Again, like the music, it's not bad. In fact, it's perfectly serviceable and better than plenty of other rhythm games out there, but it hasn't managed to really hook me in. I think I find Melody of Memory all the more disappointing because it's really the spiritual successor to the Theatre rhythm games. Theatre rhythm games? Well, that's probably more how you're supposed to pronounce it. And from my perspective, those games are superior in every way. Of course, it helps that they contain Final Fantasy music, but I also prefer the core gameplay and progression systems. Having said that, I still got quite a lot of enjoyment from Melody of Memory. I don't regret buying it, it just wasn't quite all I'd hoped for. Next up, another game that I found quite underwhelming, at least to begin with. Overwatch. I bought Overwatch at launch, but it took me a couple of years to really get into it. It seemed fun and accessible, but I found myself getting bored with it surprisingly quickly. Despite the wide range of different characters and abilities, it's quite a simple game in terms of mechanics. So it's easy to learn, and then it's up to you to reach your own personal skill ceiling. As you can probably guess, my skill ceiling is very low. You'd really have to be crawling on your belly to get under it. So I found it a little frustrating at first, as there didn't seem to be any real way for me to improve. Now that's not always a big problem for me, I don't mind remaining bad, but there were some other elements, almost specifically characters and their abilities, that annoyed the hell out of me. Actually, several abilities seem to be the sort of thing hackers would use, like Soldier 76's aimbot and Widowmaker's wall hacks. To actually include stuff like that as core gameplay elements seemed like a mistake. And then there was Mei, who could slow or even freeze you, and there's nothing more infuriating than being stuck, motionless and helpless, as your enemy slowly aims right between your eyes for a guaranteed headshot. Worst of all was Bastion, who could just turn into a turret and then spew out a devastating tidal wave of bullets. Of course, even when I was new to the game, I didn't consider these abilities to be unfair or overpowered as such, as there are tactics to use against them, and ultimately the game is pretty well balanced, much as people like to complain about balance. Even Bastion, annoying as he is almost never used in high level play because he's so vulnerable to a coordinated attack. But at lower levels, where I am naturally, he forces a style of play that's frustrating and really not all that fun. And for a casual player like me who just wants to run around shooting stuff, that's an issue. Nevertheless, as more characters were added to the game, I found more ways to enjoy it, and eventually Overwatch became a regular part of my gaming regime. I still can't play it for long stints, after a few matches I start getting bored, but I also can't go for too many days without getting the urge to load it up and explode a few heads. Okay, another first-person shooter next, but one with a rather different focus. Prey. Prey absolutely deserves its own video, and while I might do one day, I once again recommend checking out Noah Caldwell-Gervais's take on it. For me, this is kind of another game that's more defined by what I didn't like about it than by what I did. It's been spoken about very favourably by many game commentators I like and respect, but I don't quite rate it as highly. It's a good game, no doubt, a skillfully crafted immersive sim with a fascinating setting, but for me at least it doesn't really go above just being a good game. For one thing, I never really enjoyed any of the enemy encounters, whether I was going in guns blazing or trying to be more subtle about it. To be fair, I didn't explore every single option the game gives you in terms of dealing with your enemies, but from what I can tell, none of them seemed all that interesting to me. And while the story was good enough, it didn't exactly blow my mind in the way I kind of expected it to, based on what I'd heard about the game. The twists were interesting, but not particularly shocking, and the various choices you make throughout the game didn't quite have the payoff I'd hoped for. And actually, Prey really made me wonder about the best ways for games like this to communicate their narratives. There are a lot of audio logs and computer files for you to track down in Prey, and their contents are often very interesting. But games like this sometimes seem too focused on offering player freedom, and too reluctant to guide the player towards focusing on the key story points. This isn't a problem for a lot of people, I'm sure, people who studiously read every scrap of information they can get their hands on and manage to keep it all straight in their heads. But for people with terrible attention spans like me, it's possible to miss the significance of certain things until it's too late, and that can really decrease the impact of the story. Of course, on the flip side, there's stuff like the various Call of Duty campaigns where the player is absolutely railroaded into going along with the story, and I described those campaigns earlier as aggressively boring. But I think there is a balance that needs to be struck, and a game like Prey could benefit from having a few more focused, coherent plot points amongst its wider player freedoms. In any case, I did really enjoy Prey, especially the exploration elements. The environment was constructed particularly well and yielded up its secrets with satisfying reluctance. It's definitely a game worth playing. I'm reserving judgment on this next game though. Rogue Legacy 2. I loved the first Rogue Legacy. It was a simple but fun platformer with equally simple but fun roguelike elements, and I spent a fair bit of time with it. I haven't spent anywhere near as much time with Rogue Legacy 2, and in fact it's still in early access, so again this is really just my first impressions. And my first impressions are mostly good. It plays as well as ever, the handling is perhaps even sharper, and fundamentally it's got the same appealing gameplay loop of exploration, collection, combat, death, and doing it all again that made the first game so appealing. But my biggest issue with the original also still remains the fact that the game's unique selling point, the supposed inherited traits that each new character is born with, are just nowhere near as interesting as they could or should be. This is the game's chance to introduce some truly novel and interesting elements to an otherwise well-worn genre, but in the vast majority of cases they amount to little more than a slightly helpful bonus, or sometimes a massively irritating quirk. They really do very little to enhance the game. But mostly that doesn't matter, the fundamental gameplay doesn't need much enhancing. There are a few other minor irritants, some of the new additions in the sequel are poorly explained, but that may be down to the fact it's still in early access. Ultimately, unless you absolutely love the first game and really need more of it right now, I don't think there's any reason not to wait until it gets a full release. Next up, another game technically in early access, but one I can recommend a lot more enthusiastically. Satisfactory. If you don't find this sort of game appealing, Satisfactory may be akin to a torment sent from hell. And I get that. Gathering resources in order to build infrastructure, to assist you in gathering more resources, to build more infrastructure, to help you gather more resources, and so on ad infinitum, may seem more like a chore than a game. And in some cases it is, but not in Satisfactory. It doesn't do anything truly remarkable in its core gameplay, indeed it pales in comparison to something like Factorio in terms of complexity and scale, but Satisfactory is a minor miracle of good intuitive design. Allowing a player to construct vast networks of conveyor belts, linking together production hubs and far-flung mining machines, all within a vast 3D world from a first-person perspective, that's one hell of a challenge. And it's a challenge the game overcomes, and then some. It could so easily be a clunky, frustrating experience, but thanks to some excellent design choices, it's anything but. Buildings can be constructed pretty much anywhere with a few clicks of the mouse, and linking up power lines and conveyor belts is incredibly simple, when it could so easily have been a finicky, fiddly process. Of course, it's still not going to be everybody's idea of fun, but if the idea of a dozen conveyor belts arranged neatly side by side, each one bringing in a steady stream of useful goods, which are then automatically combined to form more advanced items and then taken away on a dozen more fastidiously arranged conveyor belts, if all that gives you a warm fuzzy feeling, Satisfactory is definitely the game for you. Up next, Super Meat Boy Forever. This game basically just came out and I haven't played it extensively yet, so this is yet another set of first impressions. And to be brutally honest, my first impression was really quite negative. Not because of anything that was bad, but because of the major change from the last game, of which I was a huge fan. If you're not aware, and I actually wasn't when I bought Super Meat Boy Forever, you no longer have complete control over the main character. Instead, he continually moves forward, making this a kind of endless runner. You can change which direction he moves by rebounding off a wall, and he'll stop altogether if you hit a corner without rebounding, but the screen only moves to the right, so there's no going back. In practice, this doesn't really change the gameplay in a major way. After all, the first game made it enticingly easy just to keep your finger on the sprint button at all times anyway. And the tricks and traps are much the same. Poor Meat Boy will be reduced to a red smear on a saw blade time and time again. But the fact you can't fully control the character's movement means that the sense of mastery that comes from making pixel-perfect inputs is significantly reduced. It's still a good game, I've enjoyed it so far and I don't regret buying it, although I might have if I hadn't used one of Epic's $15 coupons. I just can't help wishing they'd stuck to the winning formula of the first game. And now, the last game on this list. Titanfall 2. Yes, it's another online shooter, and this may actually be the best of them. In fact, I'd say it's one of the best online shooters ever made. I thought the first Titanfall was massively underrated, but I understood that its lack of a campaign and curious mix of on-foot and mech-based combat made it a tough sell. I was very glad to see that Titanfall 2 reached a larger audience, but I still thought it deserved more. In fact, it wasn't too long after its release in 2016 that it became tough to find enough players to get a game going here in Australia. It seems to have had a bit of a resurgence lately, possibly due to the fact it finally came to Steam, and I've been relishing the chance to get back into it, even if it's still not always easy to find a match. It really is a magnificently well-designed multiplayer game. The main mode, Attrition, which I personally think is the only way to play, pits you and your squad of half a dozen or so against a similarly sized team. So far so standard, but the battlefield is also occupied by AI-controlled soldiers from each faction. These AI soldiers offer no real resistance, but killing them nets you points, and this mode is won and lost on points, not kills. So a rather terrible player such as myself can choose to spend most of their time tracking down AI enemies and killing them. Much easier than killing enemy players, they move around too much, and tend to have better aim when they shoot back. Speaking of movement, player mobility in this game is exceptional. You're so agile, you can jump, double jump, wall run, hover and use a grappling hook if you choose the right loadout. It's insanely fun. But perhaps the game's best achievement is the fact that it manages to have players on foot and in mechs on the same battlefield without it ever feeling frustrating or totally imbalanced. Being in a mech has its advantages, sure, you can literally squash enemy players beneath your feet when you're in one, but you're also a huge target, and every player comes equipped with one of several anti-Titan weapons. And even when you have the option to call down a Titan, which is based on a timer that can be hastened by scoring points, you don't need to actually pilot it if you don't want to. You can set it to AI mode and it'll follow you around like a puppy dog, albeit one with a mouth full of laser cannons, or you can set it to guard a certain area. It's a totally viable strategy to use your Titan as a distraction while you skulk around the edges of the combat zone, picking off the opposition players who are occupied with launching rockets at your giant death mech. Anyway, it's just a great game and a huge amount of fun. If there's one takeaway I want to leave you with in this video, it's that you should get Titanfall 2 now and play it. If you're in Australia, that is. Basically, I just want there to be more people to play against, particularly people who are new to the game and I might actually be able to kill, although that seems unlikely. Okay, that's it for now. There are a few other games I was tempted to include, like Microsoft Flight Simulator, but I can't say I really play that game. I just go into drone mode and zoom around interesting places, which is pretty much what I've been doing with Google Maps for many years anyway. And thanks to my minuscule attention span, there's roughly 1,000 other games I've played for half an hour and then completely forgotten about. Seriously, my Steam library is so packed with random crap, I can spend hours just scrolling through my library, trying to figure out which game might distract me from the oppressive existential angst that comes with being alive. Anyway, Happy New Year. And remember, just because the number of the year has been incremented by 1, that doesn't mean things are suddenly going to change for the better. Or the worse, I guess, looking on the bright side. But until next year, get off my lawn.